located our card by looking it up in the book and pulling it out of the particular box. Here's our part number for the card. It shows that it's a 1982. It shows it's 2-inch diameter pipe. It shows that it fits a Cutlass, a Grand Prix, a Malibu, Monte Carlo, and Regal. Down below that it says 6-cylinder application. See catalog for application. If you have any questions, go back to the catalog. It'll explain it further. Down below it says program instructions and symbol interpretation. You want to read that. It says use 4-inch radius die. You want to make sure your 4-inch die is in here. Star, it says use half shoe. Saw cut rear to suit appearance. Now we'll go up here to our symbols and we'll find that it says the first bend, it's showing a short shoe. It still shows it on the second and it still shows it on the third. Fourth is rear, and that shows cut at 30 inches. So when we mark our tubing, we're going to mark it at 30. And one thing you might want to do is run a couple slash marks across that line at 30 to show that it's a cut and not a bend mark. That's something just to kind of help you along the way. You'll note that the first bend reads left to right. It shows you instructions, it shows you the length, it shows you the rotation, which you always start on 0, and then it shows you the depth setting. Move to the next line, it shows you the same. We're bending from right to left, so we know then that our short shoe will go into the left side of the bender. What we'll do now is we'll get our tubing and we'll get our die switched. We already know we've got the right 4-inch radius die, a 2-inch diameter, because it says it's white, and it also has the numbers on top, so we know what the dies are. We'll change those now. We'll get the tubing in so we can get it measured and get it cut. Now got our tubing, and we're ready to mark it. We know by looking at the card that we need to put the short shoe in on the left-hand side. Reason being, we bend from right to the left, shows a short shoe, so now we'll change that. It'll be so noted on the die, it'll say 200-H, which means half. Put our die in, we want to put our die in and then snug our tubing up. Nice feature about this machine, it also has a spring-loaded head. You'll note that the shaft goes in without dimpling the pipe. That's used for marking tubing and not putting a dimple in. Anytime you've got a dimple in the pipe, of course, and you should happen to come across that with a pusher die, it may dimple or wrinkle the tubing, so that's a nice feature to have. Now we'll go ahead and measure the tubing out per the card, and it'll show length marks on here, on down the line. You want to make your marks on the seam. That way you've always got a reference point to come back to. You know you've marked it across that point. The next thing you want to do is when you put your rotation dial on, you'll also want to put that on the seam. I'll explain why when we get the dial on. We'll make our marks now. Shows we've got a mark at 6, got a mark at 11 1/2, we've got a mark at 19 1/2, and then we have a cut at 30. What I said before was we'll make that cut line, we'll extend those marks out just a little bit so in case you should happen to rub one, you're still going to be able to come across it. But we'll put a couple X's across that. I do that for one reason. That way I know that's where the cut's at, and that's not a bend line. Okay? Put that away. Hang up our tape measure. Go ahead and run the ram in. We're going to line that line up with the center of these dies. We're going to leave that in the up position because that's where our rotation dial is going to go. Rotation dial goes on as such. The bottom of the tubing, you'll see there's a cutout for it. Okay? We'll do that facing you. We'll go ahead and put that on the seam of the tubing. Go ahead and snug that down on the seam. The reason why I do that, if, for instance, you're bending a pipe and this dial should happen to touch something like a vise, a bench, or something in the way, it may move it. If you had not had a reference point to go back to, you'd have to start this job all over with a new piece of tubing and start over. At least this way you've got a reference point. You know that that was 0. It was on the center of that seam line. Good thing to remember. Quick little tip. To better understand the rotation dial, let's take a closer look. You'll see the ball rotating at the bottom in its track. You'll see that we use the outside numbers for the card. When we're bending a pipe, we set this pointer right on the center line of the tubing. Okay, that's on the seam. Okay. Okay? Then when we rotate, we read the outside dial. If you were to do like a dual job, per se, on a vehicle and you needed a pipe for the other side and you didn't have the card for it, then what you'd do is you'd read the inside number, follow the card the same way, just use the inside, and it would make a mirror image of the card that you've already started to bend. The one other thing that we do, that we talk about, is we set this pointer on this seam. There's a reason for that. You may be bending and maybe bump the vise or bump a bench or bump a car or bump the hoist, something on that order. You may move this rotation dial. If you didn't have a reference point to go back, you'd have to start over. What this does is it allows you to bring that dial back to the center, and if you make that a rule of thumb, habit, you'll do it every time. You'll know what you can do to save your pipe if you ever bump it. On our first bend, it showed that we're at 6 inches, we're at 0 angle. So we're at 0 angle on our dial. That's where we want to be. Our bit depth setting is 41. So we can go ahead and set this outside dial so that it automatically shuts off on its own at 41. We'll go ahead and hit the ram in. It'll go ahead and make the bend. When it hits the end, it'll be done and it'll retract on its own. Jog feature on this bender is very nice because you can stop this as it's going back automatically. You see I had both hands on the tubing. Okay? We're going to get back to our second bend, which was at 11.5. Center that line with the center of these dies. Okay? Our bend setting is at 73 degrees, so we'll rotate that back to 73 degrees. Okay? Snug that machine up. Looks like we've got a 59 degree for your depth setting. We'll back this off to 59 degrees. She's in the automatic mode. We run the ram in, and it'll bend it to 59 and it'll retract on its own. Back off the die. You see it's backing in. We jog it and stop it. Go to our next bend. Center that line. Center the die. Bring it in. Snug it up a bit. It reads here that we're at 221 degrees. So we're reading this outside dial. Bring it right around to 221 degrees. All right? It says that our depth is 27 degrees. We'll go ahead and set that on the outside dial again. That's your automatic. And we'll bend it to 27 degrees. It'll automatically come back. We can jog the machine, stop it. We see where our cut line's at because remember we've made the 2 marks across there, okay? We can now loosen up our rotation dial, take it off, put it back in its place. We can set this in our machine then so we can see our cutoff mark, and that's where we'll cut it off. Use a rigid 30 cutter, small enough to do the job, not too large. Does a very nice job of cutting the tubing. When I cut the tubing, I always try to make the rotation of the cutter. These are simple things, but it saves you commodities, and commodities, but I mean the cutting die, the screw on it, saves the rollers. Go one direction, okay? You see where the roller's at? You're pulling that away from you, okay? And you just make a little bit of a quarter of a turn each time that comes around, and you've made your cut. Go one way with that cutter and you'll save that blade. Okay, we're going to back that ram back in, take that short section of tubing out. We now have a pipe. It did say on the card that on the cut at 30, it said down below, it says saw cut to suit appearance. So what you want to do is you want to install this tailpipe, which slides in the muffler. You want to make that mark in here wherever that quarter panel is. If you want to angle cut it, you can do it with an abrasive saw. You can do it with a Sawzall, whatever you prefer. Cut it on the vehicle or off the vehicle. And there's your finished pipe. Does a very nice job, no wrinkles. You know that pipe's going to fit.